Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the Cyber Policy Center's summer, I guess spring seminar. It feels like summer now. Real pleasure to see so many people here today. And I'm particularly excited to introduce somebody from my fellow discipline, communication. Drew is joining us all the way from UC Davis. I hope the traffic wasn't too bad. And his department just hosted a number of the students and postdocs from the social media lab last week in a big event there. And so I'm particularly excited to have Drew here. He brings three, I think, really important perspectives to the debate around social media, mental health, and youth. First, by training, he studies developmental aspects of adolescence. So a lot of the research is just bolted onto adolescence, but he has deep expertise in that. The second is the care in which he thinks about the parent-child interaction. So it's not just the kid on their own, it's not parents on their own, but it's the interaction between those. So he takes that very seriously. Fantastic new paper that just came out this month. And the last is his focus and thinking about emotion and taking emotion seriously. Not that emotion is necessarily good or bad, but that we use media to regulate our emotion, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but something that's not very well understood or considered in this debate. So we're really thrilled to have you here, Drew, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeff. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm wowed by the audience in the room and presumably online, and thrilled to have an opportunity to speak with you about something that is very near and dear to my heart, but something that is very topical right now, the debate of the effects of social media use on child and adolescent mental health. And my goal for today is to try and add some nuance to that debate that we've been having as a society, really coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, when we started to think more about youth mental health and the contributing factors to youth mental health, and identifying social media as potentially one of those things. So hopefully we can leave in an hour with a more nuanced understanding of the ways in which youth might be affected, both positively and negatively, in terms of their mental health, the processes through which that happens, and the youth that are at maybe risk for negative outcomes. So I'm not going to surprise you in any way here, but just to set the stage a little bit, adolescent social media use is near ubiquitous in the United States and in many countries around the world. 96% of 13 to 17-year-olds use social media, and about half of them categorize that type of use as nearly constant. At the same time, over the past decade, as youth social media use has increased to that ubiquitous point, we've seen a decline in adolescent mental health. The incidence rate of diagnosed mental health or behavioral health disorders among the same population, 12 to 17-year-olds, increased about 35% from 2016 to 2023. And the question that we have had over the past maybe 5 to 10 years are the two connected? And as Jeff said, where I come into this is I have a background, I'm not a developmental psychologist by training, but I have always had a developmental background and a developmental expertise. And I argue that in many ways, adolescents are uniquely susceptible out of all users to be drawn to social media use, but then to be affected by the features of social media systems that keep them engaged in the site and take advantage of their less developed self-regulation, for example, their less developed emotion regulation. Those are some of the things that I'll talk about today. So what does the science say? If we dig it, if we ignore what the popular press says, if we ignore what some books say, what does the science say? A recent umbrella review from Patty Valkenburg and colleagues in 2022 looked at 7 meta-analyses, 9 narrative, and 9 systematic reviews. And what they found was that some studies say that the relationship between adolescent social media use and mental health is weak and inconsistent. Another term you see a lot is mixed. Others that look at the exact same thing, using the exact same method, say it's substantial and deleterious. We take that to mean that it's either terrible for everyone or has no effect for anyone. And I don't think that that's the case. I think that there are some common features across common social media platforms like Snapchat, like TikTok, like Instagram, that may be particularly harmful among certain groups of adolescents that are uniquely susceptible based on their unique psychology, based on their unique demographics, based on their unique developmental stage. And so the question that I ask and the question that my lab tries to answer is, who is more or less susceptible to negative and positive effects, and why? Can we identify these subgroups within this heterogeneous group of adolescents and be able to target those that are at risk or those that are deriving positive consequences from this? Because that can inform policy. So it's not one-size-fits-all policy. That can inform interventions. These are the people that we need to reach that are at risk. So if we get into some of that nuance, some things that I think are fairly clear from the literature. Girls, as I'll show you some research today, girls are more at risk. Certain social media features, particularly unrealistic portrayals of others through beauty filters and things of that nature, as well as quantifiable feedback in the form of likes or snap streaks and things like that, and the particular adolescent socialization of girls create, as Chokas Bradley said, the perfect storm for body image issues. Research has shown among youth of color that increased time spent on social media, particularly involving racial justice issues, actually leads to increased racial discrimination, anxiety, alcohol use disorder, and drug use problems. If we look at problematic use of social media as a general context, so this is the type of use characterized by an adolescent saying, I'm getting into conflicts with my parents because I can't put my phone down. I'm supposed to go to bed at 11 o'clock, but I'm staying up till 1 o'clock just scrolling constantly because I can't stop. I feel when my phone isn't on me, I feel a sense of loss. That's that problematic type of use. A study by my graduate student, Jane Shawcroft, found that in 39 countries across the world, problematic social media use related to decreased life satisfaction among 231,000 adolescents in 39 different countries. So something is going on there. These are, right, some nuance. Gender identity, racial identity, a context of use that seem to be more strongly and consistently related to negative outcomes. But for others, there is the potential for positive effects. There's research on LGBTQ youth that they can carve out spaces on social media that are safe and supportive environments that promote overall well-being. They can find community that they may not know exists. They might find community that online that they can't find offline, and that's a great thing. Some research by Sarah Coyne and colleagues talks about the role of purposeful use. Social media curation. In her work, she finds that LGBTQ adolescents in particular are very purposeful and mindful about these are the accounts that I follow. I was following these accounts and not getting information that I wanted, not getting recommended content that I wanted, and so I'm going to unfollow those accounts because it was harming me. And I think what that underscores, though, is that that does require some degree of social media literacy among adolescents. It's putting a little bit of weight on adolescents to be very mindful about their use and think about how it benefits them or harms them and make choices accordingly. And that can be particularly difficult for a 13-year-old who's still developing in many different ways. So that's a brief view of what the science says. I'll talk a little bit about the more of the science coming out of my lab in a second, but let's check in with what the public says. A warning on social media is the very least we can do. Why scrolling on media is addictive. If you know what brain rot means, you already have it. TikTok sued for wreaking havoc on teen mental health. The anxious generation, we took this screenshot late. It was third on the New York Times bestseller list. It was first for a very long time. Dr. Anna Lemke here at Stanford, the smartphone is the modern day hypodermic needle delivering digital dopamine 24/7 for a wired generation. Here in California, Governor Newsom signs landmark bills to protect kids from social media addiction. That's a lot. That seems like a pretty clear picture in the public. If we go online, if we go onto social media itself, here's what we find. Energy takers, this doesn't work here, but you can see energy takers. We've got social media and screen time that was posted on Instagram. Here is someone 27 days sober from TikTok that they're posting online. Interesting, but okay, you do you. Why is social media not fun anymore? How to end your cell phone addiction, no social media. I quit social media, it was the best decision of my life. We have here, get off social media, right? A celebrity saying that, they're saying get off social media on social media. Again, it's a little bit of a paradox here. How I got unaddicted to social media, this is all over, right? This is not just on one platform, this is all over the case. So you're hearing in the science is saying it might be bad for some. The public is hearing that it's bad for everyone. Social media is implying, the people posting on social media, that it's bad for everyone. It's destroying mental health. I like this one. Literally everything else aside, 9/11, social media, and the pandemic were the three worst things to happen to our culture in the last 40 years. The 90s were peak humanity. As someone who grew up in the 90s, I can attest to that. I mean, that part is true. The 90s were peak humanity, and it has kind of been all downhill from there. Social media is literally ruining my life. But then we have these other viewpoints, right? We have these other viewpoints that social media, there's no detectable effect on adolescent mental health and well-being. Screens might be as bad for mental health as potatoes. There's that famous potato study from Shabalsky and colleagues that got picked up in the press. So I'm going to give the game away. We're 10 minutes into the talk. I'm going to hopefully come down somewhere between these two sides. It's not all bad for everyone. It's not fine for everyone, but there are subgroups within the population that we need to identify to understand what it is about them from their unique development, from their unique susceptibility that might be causing harm to this youth generation. So hopefully, I'm not the only one doing this, of course. We are moving toward a more nuanced understanding of how social media relates to adolescent mental health. I like to think about it in terms of conceptual and individual susceptibility factors that I look for across my research that I'll present today. Are there certain contexts like culture or use patterns that make adolescents more or less susceptible to positive and negative outcomes? Are there individuals based on their unique demographics and or psychology or development who are more or less susceptible to positive and negative effects? Because again, this comes back to me. It's nice to do this research and to have these findings, but as someone who studies children, adolescents, who cares about children, adolescents, if we don't do anything with it, I think we're missing a critical component. And so this can feed into policy work, this can feed into intervention work where we can target the people most in need of help. So the first study I'd like to present is work that I did in collaboration with colleagues and friends at Ewha Women's University in Seoul, South Korea. In May of 2022, so just coming out of the pandemic when the world was starting to open up again, we fielded a survey among US and Korean adolescents. You can see about 1,200 US adolescents, nearly 1,000 Korean adolescents. Measures of general social media use time, but also specific contexts of use, like that pathological, excessive, or problematic use. We tested for configural metric and scalar invariance, and we found that they were invariant, so they had the same meaning, the same structure, and the same participants used the scales in the same way in the two surveys, and the surveys were exactly the same, minus some minor differences for cultural differences. And I was really struck by the findings because they were rather consistent. Which sometimes it's hard to find when you're dealing with youth and when you're dealing with humans in general, because we're messy and there are a lot of differences between us. Plot A in the top there is modeling depressive symptoms, just general social media use and depressive symptoms. The black line that you can see there are South Korean adolescents. The dotted line are United States adolescents. What we see, social media has no effect, or no relationship, I should say, with depression among South Korean adolescents, but a significant and positive relation with US adolescents. We see the same thing over here, plot C, social media and anxiety symptoms. The South Korean line is actually slightly negative. It's not significant, but it is slightly negative, whereas that slope for American adolescents is positive again. Over here, plot D, social media and loneliness, we see a flat line that American adolescent social media use has no relationship with loneliness, but in South Korea it actually is negatively related with loneliness. So if anything, American adolescents seem to be at risk for depression and anxiety. South Korean adolescents, if anything, less loneliness. If we flip over to here, this is modeling pathological or problematic social media use on depressive symptoms on your left and anxiety symptoms on your right. One clear thing from the literature is that when we break it down to this problematic or pathological type use, the effects, the statistical effects, tend to be stronger relative to general time-based measures. And it shows pretty consistently in meta-analyses and reviews that pathological or problematic social media use is related to increased depression, increased anxiety among adolescents around the world. We see that here. Both of the lines for South Korea and United States adolescents show a statistically significant and positive slope. What we see, though, is that in both cases, the trajectory of that slope is significantly steeper for United States adolescents. And if you look at the effect size, it's about double in the United States compared to South Korean adolescents. So even when South Korean adolescents are using social media in a way that seems that would have negative effects, it does, just not at the same rate or at the same statistical effect, the same magnitude as American adolescents. And so that caused us to think about a few things. And this is work that I did with my former graduate student, Michael Carter, now at Boston Children's Hospital, Harvard University. We started to think about social media and our own unique social media use as being in a unique environment. Right? There are, I don't know, 75 people in this room. It doesn't make any sense to think that my social media environment looks anything like the rest of yours. We use different combinations of platforms. We use different features. We're connected with different people. We have different likes. The algorithms learn from that and recommend different content to us. So the hour that I spend looks fundamentally very different than the hour you spend or the 2 hours that you spend. I always say we have corgis. My wife is on Instagram. It is just corgis and corgi influencers. That's all it is. I doubt that anyone in this room has an Instagram feed that looks quite like that, right? And that's because the algorithm has picked up on that. She made conscious choices about who to follow and so on. So if we start to think about that, is there something special or different about the way that South Korean adolescents use social media that has that seemingly at least somewhat protective effect that we just saw? Is there something special or different about the social media features available on social media platforms in South Korea compared to in America? Because if you look at regulatory differences, there are some key differences in South Korea compared to the US, and that might account for those different social media environments. And just to give you a sense of what this looks like, this is just a figure from our work. We borrowed from Yuri Bronfenbrenner and the ecological systems approach, where you center a child, right, in an offline world. They have their microsystem, the people right around them that sits in the mesosystem, it sits in the the exosystem. And we just modeled that using adolescent data and the way that they talked about their social media environments. And what you see on the outside here is their offline microsystem that then shapes their digital microsystem and so on. That the way the system is constructed, the features that the individual uses, the people that they're connected with, all of this creates a hyper-specific social media environment for that person. And we can start to think about that and theorize about that and model that and test for it in our designs to get to this individual level specific type of effect that I think is what we're missing, or what we've largely been missing in this debate over adolescent social media use and mental health. So if we talk about those regulatory differences, the US notably has very few regulations pertaining to social media use, particularly among youth. Although this is changing, my graduate student Samantha Vigil has been working on what we're calling the Youth Digital Policy Repository. We've been tracking the bills across the United States and now have expanded it to across the world that are being considered in state legislatures, federal legislatures, aimed at regulating social media in some particular way for youth. And it's been fascinating to watch the trajectory of how quickly these bills are coming up before state legislatures and tracking which bills are being passed, what are the provisions included in them. So we intend for this to be a living document that we update as often as we can, just to get a sense of how we're talking about these policies in the United States and around the world. At last count, there's about 30, I think now 35 states that either have a bill on the books or working its way through the state legislature. And that went from about 0 5 years ago to 35 5 years later, so it's happening very quickly. If we look at South Korea, we see that South Korea has stricter age verifications. You actually need to show that you're 13 years of age in order to sign up for a social media account. So there are fewer underage and less developed individuals on social media in South Korea relative to the United States. As anyone with a child knows, or anyone that remembers from your own youth, you just need to pick a birth date that indicates that you're older than 13, and it's come on in. And that's the way it has been for a long time here. In South Korea, there's parental consent. Parents need to consent for their children to open a social media account. So at the very least, they are aware that their child has a social media account. Many parents in the United States are not aware of certainly the extent of their children's social media presence, simply because children can sign up for an account by themselves. There's stricter moderation of content in South Korea for those under the age of 19, which is the age of consent in South Korea. And all of these things can help with both time, content exposure, and problematic use. Of course, there are cultural differences too between South Korea and the United States, and this is part of a long-term grant that I'm on that we're trying to tease apart the role that culture plays in this and the role that cultural differences in terms of regulation play. Because if they're doing things regulation-wise that are helping, that can be a model for us and other countries, and not just, we can pick which things seem to be most effective rather than a top-down, one-size-fits-all kind of policy regulation. Another thing that we started to think of in terms of personal social media environments is the role of algorithms and the role of recommended content from those algorithms. Each social media company, of course, has a proprietary algorithm that recommends different content to different users, and in doing so helps to create that unique personal social media environment. What I see is not necessarily what you see because of our unique interests, because of the things we click on, the things that we follow, when we slow down, when we're scrolling, all those sorts of things. And if that's the case, we shouldn't expect to see a large between subjects effect, but rather larger effects for certain subgroups, right, based on similarities in their social media environments or the features that they use and things of that. And we can break that down by the use of certain design features like using filters. Again, aimed at getting at this more nuanced approach and a nuanced understanding of who is at risk or who is not affected at all by social media use. So what we did most recently, this was led by a colleague of mine, Martin Hilbert at UC Davis. We created 132 fake accounts on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok, and we set the age of all the accounts to 18, and we took the baseline recommended content that the algorithm sent to us. Then we engaged in some experimental manipulations. We manipulated age. We either acted like an 8 or a 16-year-old. We manipulated gender. We acted like a female or a male. And among the 16-year-old accounts specifically, we acted like we were undergoing or experiencing a mental health struggle or not. And all of the manipulations, all of the behavioral things came from actual behaviors that we witnessed, that my team witnessed, seeing from children and adolescents on social media, as well as interviews with 50 children, adolescents, and parents of children and adolescents. So we tried to have as much ecological validity as we could possibly have. So after we took that recommended content at baseline, we engaged in the manipulations. We then came back 1 week later, following the manipulations, and then a week following that, and took the recommended content each time. And then in what was really fun, and what I would encourage everyone to do, is manually code 7,200 pieces of content. That we wanted to use humans to do this, and so we constructed a large team of undergraduates and PhD students and faculty members to go through this to actually see what content and the nature of the content that is being recommended to accounts that are at least acting like children and adolescents that are struggling with their mental health. On the left here, you see we rated it for whether it was child-directed or not, whether it was problematic or not, and whether it was mentally distressing or not. And you can see political murder speculation up here, not probably directed toward a child. Baby sign language, much more child-directed content. Problematic content, soccer free kick, not problematic at all, unless you really don't like soccer. Sexual suggestiveness, probably more problematic, certainly for an 8-year-old account, right? Down here, distressing content, there's nothing wrong with cute animals. I have one, I love them, that's great. A weight loss challenge might be mentally distressing for someone, particularly someone who doesn't feel comfortable with their body or the way that they look. And if we look then on the panels on the right, we see that from pre-session to post-session, so we lumped the post-sessions together, that week 1 and week 2 content, the algorithm learned pretty quickly who was a child and who was an adolescent. You can see the control group, the 16-year-olds, child-directed content dropped from pre to post. The struggling accounts, those were 16-year-olds, that dropped from pre to post. But the child accounts, the people acting like 8-year-olds, got significantly more child-directed content aimed at them. And anyone would say, well, Drew, that's what an algorithm is designed to do. It is, but an 8-year-old is not supposed to be on any of these social media platforms. They're supposed to be 13 or above. So this would indicate that if you wanted to do something to age verify, this could be an indicator, right, that, hey, let's check in with you. Are you just a 37-year-old man that likes child content, or are you actually an 8-year-old, right? And start to figure that out. But what I think is more concerning, honestly, are panel D and F. So panel D is the problematic content. So this was rated as anything rated R or above. We use the motion picture rating guide as our kind of coding scheme. And you can see for the 16-year-olds that weren't struggling with their mental health, we see a significant, small but significant drop in the amount of problematic content. And we see a slightly larger drop for the child accounts. I would still point out that the child accounts were about 12% of their content that they were getting was rated R or higher. So that's still a significant amount of content. But you see the adolescents struggling with their mental health. It's not a significant difference, but it doesn't follow the same trend. It actually increased slightly from pre to post. You see it really in more detail in plot F. The amount of mentally distressing content, it didn't change for the 16-year-old accounts. It dropped slightly for the child accounts. Again, about 12% though is still now both rated R and mentally distressing for an 8-year-old child. But we see this huge jump in distressing content being recommended by the algorithms to adolescents struggling with their mental health. And I tell this story very quickly because my graduate students came to me and they showed me some of that content. And it was so bleak, so dark. Adolescents crying at a window, saying that they don't want to go on, that we became concerned for the people coding. It was just so dark. And I didn't want a bunch of 20-year-olds looking at this content and coding it over and over and over again. That's what is being recommended to these mentally struggling accounts. And yes?
Could you just give us an example of a behavior, maybe for each of the things? Like, how did you make an 8-year-old? How did you act like a female? And how did you act like
Yeah, absolutely. We manipulated the profile picture for gender and age. We manipulated the accounts that they followed. So we talked to like an 8-year-old. Who do you like to follow, right? And then we just liked those accounts. And then we liked the content, I think the top 2 things from that account for each. Same with adolescents. We made posts where it was very clear that we were a child, right? Like we wanted to go on a play date at the park with our friend, versus an adolescent wanting to go to the movies or go driving or something. And then with the mentally distressing accounts, we did all the same, but we found a bunch of accounts online where adolescents would say like, I'm so depressed, everybody hates me. And that would be the post. So it was very overt, I will say, but it was also very minimal, right? It was maybe a 20-minute session for each of these 132 accounts. And clearly the algorithm picked up on that just from that 20 minutes. Yep. And so what I want to kind of end on here, I think I'm doing okay on time, is that these nuanced environments that we construct and that features of social media construct for us equal nuanced effects. I'll note that there are many studies using between subjects designs that do show a negative association between adolescent social media use and aspects of mental health. But for the people that say there's not much going on here, they do note correctly that the effects when they do occur tend to be small. As I mentioned earlier, when you focus on problematic or pathological use, that shows more consistent and stronger associations. But my question when we look at these things is, might we be masking a subsample that's more at risk? If 20% of the population of adolescents derives benefits from social media use, and 30% are at risk for negative effects, and the rest aren't affected, if you lump those together in a sample and take a between subjects effect, it's going to be small. It might be significant, it might be negative, but it'll be small. But I would argue that that's masking that 30% at risk, and that's the group that I want to try and figure out more about. So Patty Valkenburg, a friend and colleague of mine at the University of Amsterdam, started this work, and this was the first paper, I believe, out of it in 2021, using intensive ecological momentary assessment and dynamic structural equation modeling to understand these subgroups, the people who are susceptible to positive effects, negative effects, and null effects. This study was about 400 Dutch adolescents, 13 to 15, completed 6 surveys a day for 21 days. Just showing you, this is the person-specific effect size. If you look at the between subjects effect, that's the solid dark line in the middle there. It's a beta of negative 0.01. So if that's what you report, it looks like there's no effect for this sample. But you can see substantial variation. There are people on the right for whom social media use is increasing. This is self-esteem. And then you can see many people on the left here for whom it's decreasing self-esteem. And you can see that in the figure on the right. The gray lines are those that have no statistical effect. The green lines are those that have a positive effect, and the red lines are those that have a negative effect. And what they found across a few studies, self-esteem, 88% of the sample showed no effect, 4% showed a positive effect, 8% a negative effect. And this is longitudinal over time, so you can control for baseline, and you can look for individual fluctuations over time, and you can look for overall fluctuations across all those 126 data points that you take. In a different study led by Ina Bayens, 60 Dutch adolescents looking at affect, 44% had no effect, 46% had a positive effect, but there's still that 10% showing a negative effect, that social media use is leading to decreased affect. If you look at affective well-being, again, 45% null, 26% positive, 28% negative. So there is a sizable group here, but in these studies between 8 and 28% susceptible to a negative effect across a variety of different well-being indicators. With my friend Sarah Coyne at Brigham Young University, we ran a similar study in the United States, this was summer of 2023. We collected data from 183 adolescent participants, mean age of 15. We did 4 surveys a day for 17 days, 68 surveys a person. I don't know how the Dutch are able to get their adolescents to follow directions so well. I have not been able to figure that out yet. I have not been able to create that magic in the United States. But 68 data points is still enough to do this type of analysis. In this study, we wanted to focus on body esteem and body positivity, to focus on that aspect of mental health. Similar, 44% had a null effect on body esteem, 17% positive, but these numbers are starting to get a little bit bigger. 36% have a negative effect when they use social media over time. 36% show a negative effect with body esteem, 32% show a negative effect with body positivity. What we were able to do in this study for the first time is have a baseline survey where we measured demographic, dispositional, developmental, and social factors that we could use to predict membership in these different groups. For body image, what we found is that women, those higher in trait perfectionism and those higher in problematic social media use, were more likely to be in the negative group compared to the positive group. This is data from my graduate student's dissertation that she just defended. She's off to Ohio State in the fall. We used data from over 230,000 adolescents in 39 countries across the world. I mentioned that earlier. I wanted to put this in here to kind of hone in on that context of use, that problematic type of social media use. We're modeling problematic social media use and life satisfaction here. That dotted red line is 0, no effect whatsoever. You can see almost everything is significant and on the negative side of that, where problematic social media use is related to less life satisfaction. What you might notice here, though, is that fairly consistently the blue group is closer to 0 than the green group. The green group are adolescent females. The blue group are adolescent males. So in 37 of the 39 countries, adolescent females showed a stronger, significant negative relationship between problematic social media use and mental health compared to males. Again, indicating that 1, gender identity seems to be one of those individual difference factors, but also 2, that this pathological or problematic social media use seems to be a very consistent predictor of, in this case, lower life satisfaction. Finally, we ran an additional study because we're gluttons for punishment, and we collected another EMA study in summer of 2024 in the United States, 135 adolescents, mean age of about 15 again, 60 surveys over 3 weeks. In this case, we were looking at platform differences and content. We were just getting into the data right now. One initial finding that I find very interesting here is that adolescents experience significant variation from baseline over the 3-week period in their sense of purpose and their anxiety symptoms after seeing unwanted sexual content across platforms. So what that means is it's not a positive effect, it's not a negative effect. It's not that seeing unwanted sexual content causes more anxiety or causes a lower sense of purpose. But what it's doing is after you see that content and report it in the survey, there is substantial and significant variation from your baseline. That afterwards, your sense of purpose goes up, but then it goes down, and anxiety goes up and goes down. And what I think is really interesting about that, this is the first study that I know of that found something like this. This is, again, my grad student, Jane, who was modeling this. But if this is the case, it's really interesting for treatment. If you are experiencing variability in your anxiety symptoms, if you're not anxious all the time, you might not seek treatment. You might not, a psychiatrist might not pick up on that based on when you go in. Sense of purpose, I think, is really interesting because sense of purpose is supposed to be fairly stable, certainly by adolescence, right? Where we're starting to train adolescents for what the next step is and where you're going to go to college or what sort of job you're going to get next. And if your sense of purpose in life is going up and down significantly after you're exposed to unwanted sexual content, that's something really interesting. And these are things that might not be picked up in self-report data, right, for a cross-sectional survey or something like that, these variations. So I just wanted to talk about that today because we just found this and I've been thinking about it, but I think it adds, if anything, an additional level of nuance to this story. A quick note before I wrap up here. Together, these studies show, if we look at all these kind of ecological momentary assessment studies, they show that about 8 to 36% of the samples at risk for negative outcomes across a fairly wide array of negative outcomes. What I always say is there are 42 million adolescents in the United States. There are 1.3 billion adolescents in the world. In many countries, 90%, 95% are on social media. Even if it's 8%, in the United States, that's 4 million adolescents. And that's just one variable. That's just self-esteem. We're starting to begin to understand which adolescents are more at risk. A question that I have that we're starting to work on is the same individual susceptible to multiple negative effects? Am I, if I'm at risk, am I susceptible to negative effects on my body image and depression and anxiety? Or am I just susceptible to negative body image and someone else is susceptible to depression and another person is susceptible to anxiety? If it's that case, if it's the latter case, then these numbers and the total number of adolescents at risk are actually far higher than what I already think is a pretty big number. Hopefully what you've seen over this talk, hopefully what I've been able to effectively communicate to you, is that there are relatively consistent links if we look among certain subgroups between social media, different types of social media use across platforms, and multiple aspects related to youth mental health. Time and the type of use or the content or the recommended content are related to these things and play into this level of nuance, at least among certain adolescents. Proprietary algorithms owned by the social media companies help to shape our personal social media environments, thus making individuals more or less susceptible, or taking people who are already susceptible and perhaps making them even more susceptible to negative effects. Certainly not all adolescents are susceptible to negative mental health outcomes, but I think we're looking at multiple studies from multiple countries, from multiple states across the United States that are showing a pretty clear picture that a sizable group is susceptible to negative outcomes. So what we're doing in the lab, if you invite me back next year, I can talk about these things. We're trying to understand parents. As Jeff said, I focus a lot on families. What do parents think about this? We just did a survey with my grad student Samantha that just was accepted for publication, where I was shocked. We asked about the different provisions in all the social media policies across the United States. Are you in support of them or not? Do you think they'll help your adolescent or not? There was no variation. The parents were like, yes, we want it, yes, it will help. And what it said to me is that parents are just desperate. They want something, they want some help. They need help negotiating this social media environment that I think to them has rapidly gotten out of control, that in their busy lives, they just can't manage the same way that you could maybe just 10 years ago. Sarah Coyne and I at Brigham Young are doing a longitudinal study of the Utah social media bill. That is supposed to go into effect, we'll see if it actually ever does, but does it have a measurable effect on adolescent mental health? We're doing a longitudinal study of cell phone policies by school district to see if that has any measurable impact on student testing scores. We were able to get access to student testing scores, and Utah and California both have bills coming on where every school district needs to implement a social media policy of some kind, so we can treat this as a natural experiment that's occurring. And I'm curious about algorithm bias in other countries that have different regulatory structures. With some friends and colleagues in Amsterdam, we're talking about trying to replicate that algorithm study in the EU, testing the general data protection regulation and their different privacy regulations that are in place already in the European Union. And so with that, I'd like to thank you so much again for the invitation, for your time. Thanks to colleagues at Ewha Women's University, Brigham Young University, the National Research Foundation of Korea that's funded some of this work, the Susan Crown Exchange, my graduate students, and I include the picture on the right just to show you, A, how short my lab is, and how little they care about including me in the picture. So thank you again so much. I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Drew. I will be looking at my phone because there may be questions online, not because I'm distracted from you. Thanks for just fantastic work. I'm really becoming increasingly convinced that this idea of heterogeneity, that there's some groups are not. And one thing just as I was watching your talk is I would love to hear how you think about, let's say, that 8% to 36%. As susceptible, relative to thinking about just adolescent development where some percentage, if I remember correctly, it's somewhere around a third of adolescents will experience some mental health issues. So how do you think about just the general fact that about a third of adolescents will have some mental health struggle right around the ages we're talking about? Like, I think that's the most typical time for onset, versus this unique aspect that's related to social media use.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I will say there's a paper that came out about a week ago by Amber van der Waal and colleagues at the University of Amsterdam. And yes, I believe that's the case, where they have a sample. It's a 100-day diary study, and they sampled depressed adolescents and non-depressed adolescents, clinically depressed adolescents and non-clinically depressed adolescents. And what they found is that depressed adolescents and non-depressed adolescents used social media in similar ways over the course of those 100 days, but the depressed adolescents showed more significant and negative outcomes from that. So to me, that's at least some initial evidence that social media is playing a unique role, and that it's not that adolescents, because of all the things that are going on developmentally, lead to mental health problems, and then that leads to problematic social media use. But again, that there is a unique factor of social media. And I always come back to the features. I talk about, I started the talk by saying adolescents are uniquely susceptible to the design of social media. Everyone in this room has been watching Netflix, with not a social media platform, but I watched it last night, and I'm guilty of this. You watch Netflix, you watch 2 episodes, and then it counted down 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, and the next one came on, and you're like, sure, I'll watch another one. And we're all cognitively developed adults in this room. We all have developed self-regulation. We've had many, many more years to practice self-regulation than adolescents. And so I think that social media platforms may be interesting spaces for depressed and anxious teens, but then once they're there, those features further take advantage of the developmental susceptibility, the mental illness susceptibility, keeping them there and driving that problematic use that we see consistently as a negative indicator.
Got it. So just if I'm understanding you correctly, you see it sort of social media as a complex intensifying factor, or also something that can lead maybe an adolescent that's on a healthy trajectory gets diverted and ends up having some mental health struggles.
I think both could be the case.
Okay.
And I think you see that too with that algorithm study that I presented. And what concerns me about that is anyone with an adolescent knows that they have a bad day and they vent. So they go and vent online for 20 minutes. Well, that venting has that outcome that we saw, that now they're saying they're depressed, they're saying their parents don't get them. Now they're being recommended content that, as we found, was pretty dark and bad. Right. That I think is a big concern. I'd like to do so much more work in that area.
Yeah, no, I agree. When you look at content that have been served to somebody that's struggled with mental health, it can be very disturbing, especially if you consume it all at once.
Right.
It's really eye-opening.
And remember too, with that study, we were taking, I believe, the top 10 pieces of recommended content. That's a far cry from endless scroll. That's a far cry from what you might see if you are sitting up late at night scrolling for 2 hours straight.
I want to follow up on your point about features. I think that's super important. We tend to think of social media as, sui generis. There's so many differences across platforms, even within. What are some of the features, in addition to, say, endless scroll, that you think might be important to either regulate or provide some education on? Are there any other ones?
There's a lot. I mean, age verification. I think we need to know if we say that you need to be 13 years of age to be on social media, we need to know that that is the actual case. The best estimates are about 40% of 8 to 12-year-olds have a social media account. If we say that adolescents are uniquely susceptible, then an 8 to 12-year-old is even more uniquely susceptible, right? Because they're just less developed in many different ways. Time restrictions, or things that make it give you a little bit of friction to remind someone, to remind an individual who doesn't have developed or fully developed self-regulation that, hey, you've been scrolling for 2 hours. Maybe you should do something else. Now, of course, those things aren't particularly attractive to social media companies because it reduces engagement. but it would take less advantage of what we know about adolescent development.
Great. I want to think a little bit about how you conceptualize the balance across the heterogeneous population. So you've got some portion that are struggling, some portion that are thriving, and a larger portion typically that are not. As you think about doing this study with Utah where there's a ban, how do you think about either measuring or balancing the fact that some people who receive no harm or thrive are being traded off for that negative?
Yeah, so it's not a ban. The Utah bill is not a ban. I know many other countries are considering those kinds of things. And that's where I think having this level of nuance can help guard against that very question, Jeff, because I don't want to hurt the people that are doing well. But I want to figure out who they are and what they're doing so that we can take that null group in the middle and maybe move some of them up to that positive group, or figure out who are the ones that are struggling and at least move them to the null group. And so what we're trying to look at is the different provisions in these bills and understand, are there some that tend to help more of the people at risk but not hurt the people that are doing okay? And if that's the case, then that helps to create not just a one-size-fits-all bill, but one that's going to bring up the people that need the help and, again, not hurt those that are doing okay.
Right. Well, that brings me to my last one, and then I'll go online into the room. What I really love about your work that you presented today was that idea of the sort of personal social media environment and drawing on brown front banners. When parents sort of corner me to talk about social media and their kid in particular, it's always a struggle to separate sort of population statistics to the kid that they're trying to center on. You started to get at some of the characteristics that you think are important. So in the one study, it was trait perfectionism, problematic social media use.
And being female.
So are those right now kind of your leading sort of factors that you think about when you think, okay, if we were to take a kid and you just say, tell me their measurements on these three things, right now those are the three most important characteristics, right?
Well, I think they're the most important that we've found so far. I think there are so many more that we can focus on. Gender is a pretty clear, I mean, that figure that I showed where social media has a stronger negative relation with life satisfaction for females in 37 out of 39 very different countries. I mean, that's a pretty clear indicator that there is something to do with gender. And my graduate student actually connected that to concurrent and historical indicators of gender inequality in those countries. And we actually found some evidence that health inequality is the leading driver. Countries with larger disparities in terms of male and female health are the ones that have the stronger or the wider difference between the two. The other one that I think is pretty clear is that context of use, that it's excessive time, it's the struggle to stop, it's the feeling of anxiety when your phone isn't on you or when you aren't able to make a connection on or get on social media. Those are pretty clear. The perfectionism one, that one popped and wasn't really expecting that, but it does make theoretical sense in the case of body image. Right. So I think there's so much more work to do to really hone in on what are the most important factors. I do think gender and problematic use are two of those, though.
Any thoughts? I'll just do one last follow-up. Any thoughts on the protective side? So who's getting put into that 10% on the top side?
Yeah, so those, because of how we compared it, so in the body image study, men tended to be more in the positive side. Those with a healthy relationship, a non-problematic relationship, and those less perfectionist, right?
Okay.
But there is evidence that LGBTQ populations, right, tend to derive benefits from social media use. They also derive harms too, in the form of bigotry and just hate speech and things like that. But it does that when you talk to them, they say that it can create a safe space. As I mentioned, though, it does require a lot of work on their part to do that. It doesn't just come to them. They have to put in the effort to find that.
Right. Great. Okay, well, let's open it up to the room for any questions. Fang Jing has the mic. Okay, yeah, Daphne, thanks so much. And then we'll go online.
Thank you. You both said something that I found very interesting, which was that seeing some of this really, really awful content changed how you thought about the problem. And I come from a background of platform trust and safety, and a world where you encounter the really bad content all the time and have this sort of starting point of like, of course, you don't staff somebody to look at it for a whole shift, and you make sure they have mental health resources available, et cetera. But I mean, because that was such an important moment for both of you, I'm curious, kind of like methodologically, how you think about that. Like, if somebody's going to be a researcher in this space, should there be a starting point where they look at a range of kinds of content so everybody's coming in with that same basis? Or if you understood the data to mean one thing at time A, and then by time B, the data was the same, but now you'd seen this content,
So like you were desensitized to it almost?
Yeah, well, just how do we think about the conclusions that you draw in light of the data being influenced by the content? Like, if seeing the content is that important, then should seeing the content go into the methodology somewhere, so we're all analyzing things the same way?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really interesting question. It's not one that we expected, right, when we were doing this study. Now that we have this corpus, we could, just thinking aloud here, we could show, data or content that we've already created and show like, this is distressing content, and train on that. We were kind of going at it from a very exploratory lens, but I think that's an excellent point.
Yeah, I agree, Daphne.
To train on that, yeah.
Yeah, most research in this space just has ignored content. It's just like time. There are some measures of problematic social use, but content is ignored because it's basically impossible until recently. Look at Drew's work with 7,200 pieces of content. It took a small army. So I think that now there's the LLM space, thinking about what Dave Wilner and Samita are working on, where we could start to actually analyze content in real time and at scale, which could be exciting.
And there is increasing attempts to get adolescents to donate their data. Now, there are questions about the types of adolescents that are willing to donate to a strange researcher relative to one who wouldn't. But then we can use these new approaches to actually look at the content that they're seeing. The question that I have, though, and I was talking about this with Sunny earlier, is that when you talk to adolescents in focus groups and things, and you talk about the content, they often don't remember it. They can't point to being like, I saw that thing and it was bad, or it made me feel this way. So, yes, I'm just very curious about that, because there is so much content, and it almost becomes, it's not just one piece or two pieces, but almost a weight of a continued infinite scroll of similar content that just weighs on you, that maybe you couldn't pick out. It was that one that made me feel bad, but it was all of that together over the course of 30 minutes, an hour, or what have you.
Great. We're going to ask a last question that we try to kind of ask all of our seminar speakers. So you're a fantastic researcher, a lot of rigor, but we want to take the microscope up a level. And we have a great question from online, which is a policy question. So what do you think, in your view, given your research, the advisability of social media bans are for social media, for adolescents overall?
A total ban?
Well, the bans that are sort of now being
like in
implemented.
Australia.
In Australia, there'll be total ban. We're seeing different kinds of school-based bans here that are either social media or phone-based. So there's a lot of variability. So do you have any take on any of the different policies based on your work?
I understand that you need to pick an age, right? We pick age. 18 is the arbitrary age when you can join the army, and 21 is kind of the arbitrary age when you can drink. I'd like to see more evidence to understand, when does the potential for risk decrease age-wise based on development. Australia says 16. I think John Haidt says 16. I don't know where that number's coming from, and I want to make sure that that number is based in science and based in what we know about human development, and when we can say with some certainty that banning this will mitigate risks, and now allowing an adolescent to get on there will not create substantially more risks for that individual because of where they are developmentally.
Right. If you think developmentally, you could identify for maybe the population where you're most likely to reduce the
Right.
highest amount of harm.
Right. And of course, not everyone develops at the exact same rate. It's not that at 15 you suddenly have self-regulation and at 14 and 365 days you don't.
Right.
But on average, when can we say that we're mitigating more risks than benefits?
Right. Fantastic. We have many more questions online. Super stimulating work. Thank you for taking such a careful and balanced view of it all. And please join me in thanking Drew. Thank you very much, Drew.
Thank you all so much. Thanks.
And join us next week for our very last speaker in the series this year, and that's Joanna Smolinski. So please join us next